Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, one thing I would like to do in the coming year or two is have some more scholars of disability studies on the show. For example, I'm hoping to have my Virginia Tech departmental colleague Ashley Shue on to talk about her book, Against Technoableism: Rethinking Who Needs Improvement. I think a classic finding or assertion in disability studies, it's a truism in the field basically, is that a lot of people think they can make assertions about the needs and desires of disabled people without, well, even bothering to ask disabled people how they see things. When we see this reality, well, it opens up a bunch of empirical questions of reconstructing the experiences of disabled people, including, by the way, by attending to the writings, poetry, music, and so on of folks with disabilities. And I think we have all kinds of good work of this empirical sort. I mean, disability studies is really a subfield that has grown and thrived so much over the last 10 or 15 years. I'm thinking, for instance, of the episode we did with Raquel Velliou about her book about the barriers disabled people face in the London public transportation system, just as one example. And I think today's guest, Meryl Alper, Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Northeastern University, has given us several strong works along these lines over the course of her career. Meryl is also an educational researcher who has worked over the past 20 years to make inclusive and accessible learning products with media organizations such as Sesame Workshop, Nickelodeon, and PBS KIDS. In our conversation, we use her book, Kids Across the Spectrums: Growing Up in the Digital Age, as a launching point for a broader conversation about the empirics of disability studies. Kids Across the Spectrums, for instance, is based on research with more than 60 neurodivergent children from an array of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And among other things, Meryl finds that these inequalities of class and race and such make an enormous difference to the kinds of support these young people have. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Meryl Alper, someone I have had great respect for such a long, long time. And so I can say to you, in all honesty, hey, get excited! Meryl, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you.
Well, Kids Across the Spectrums is a cool book. If you're explaining it to a stranger, what do you tell them it's about? What were you trying to do with it?
So I was trying to make sense of all of these stereotypes and myths that exist around autism and technology and kids as part of that, and to actually spend time with kids, autistic kids, and their families getting their perspective. This is the population that's so often talked about and really not talked with. So what I wanted to do was to be able to make sense of that. And beyond that, think about how do the ways that young people on the autism spectrum are engaging with media and technology, what might that mean for all of us in how we're socially navigating this networked world?
Yeah, it's a cool twist at the end. You start with Bruno Bettelheim's short story, piece, Joey, a Mechanical Boy, probably best thought of as a short story. And, you kind of pull it apart as, I think probably it has a great deal of influence about how we think about these things, but also how these metaphors of mechanical and robotic. I mean, I've even heard parents of autistic kids use those terms to describe like how their children are socially. So can you pull it apart a bit for us and just, inform us about where this metaphor of like roboticism came from?
Yeah. So Bettelheim is a really kind of fraught historical figure in terms of his influence on child psychology, on sort of rehabilitative sort of schools, and a very dark time, I think, in kind of US history around the relationship between parents and their children with disabilities, and around institutionalization, and really sort of a deeply sexist perspective on if disability is bad, kind of quote with a big capital B, then who is with the capital B, like where does the blame lie? And with Bettelheim, and along with kind of other folks kind of framing this refrigerator model mother, like, it's the mothers are to blame. Mm-hmm. So you have some sort of this disdain for the mechanical, for mechanization, that's kind of embedded in that discourse. But there's, Joey as a pseudonym is a case study that Bettelheim writes up in Scientific American. And and includes self-portraits, Joey, pictures that Joey drew, of himself, of his interests. And so it's interesting as an artifact, because it's the same kind of thing that researchers might do nowadays. You ask a child to draw themselves, and you use that solicitation as a jumping off point. That's not what Bettelheim is doing here. He's using it as evidence of Joey's desire to be a machine, to not be human, and then that sort of places Bettelheim in the role of the bestower of the human onto his subject. And that really opens a Pandora's box then of all kinds of interventions that are not designed to work with children necessarily, but are designed to kind of solicit desired responses, and the sort of medicalization of those responses and those sort of protocols for kind of getting a desired response that is measurable, that is adaptable, that can be marked in particular kinds of ways. It's that metaphor that then traces through all sorts of other forms of intervention. And then in particular, we think about technologies of intervention, that same sort of quantifiable, modifiable way of, again, sort of using the technology to the idea that here is this figure that is like a computer, like something that is routine, that is rote, and the ways in which that, just sort of evacuates the human from these young people. And so I wanted to, in the book, make sure that was front and center.
Yeah. Your book was, one reason I enjoyed reading it the last few days is because I've been thinking and talking for a couple years now about how psychology as a discipline is not well represented in STS world. And in fact, when most people in STS write about psychological categories, I'm thinking like Ian Hacking, for instance, there's this kind of critical taking apart of showing how these kind of, these psychological categories they're oppressive, they're sexist, they're racist, they're all those things for good reason, because they often were. And in fact, you're doing some of that work here too. I mean, you're showing all these categories are fraught, that you're going through are fraught and have a lot of baggage. At the same time, you are interested in childhood development and learning, like how theories of these things have played out over time, And so I thought it was very interesting to watch you kind of strike a balance between constantly problematizing the categories you're using and trying to not to build in assumptions, but also trying to learn from development folks, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would consider myself somebody who, so part of my background is in early childhood education, but I also have like an undergraduate degree in communication and history. So I'm always looking to kind of understand, what came before this, what are the history of ideas, including the ones that I'm then now studying to see how they are observed in children. Yeah. And I started off my undergrad research career actually in a psychology lab, studying kids doing spatial cognition. But, so I'm very interested in, how do we problematize it? But also, for the chapter, for example, that's on identity development and how are young people on the autism spectrum drawing on this world of media, this potential for technologies for self-publication and for self-representation. How does that play into their ideas about being autistic, and how being autistic is connected to all other aspects of their identity? And to do that, I have to kind of think about, well, in what ways might existing theories of identity development make sense with this population? In what ways do these theories fall short? Because I think that's the work of theory building. You consider, here's a case that I have and it doesn't really fit here. How can I adapt it? But I don't think we sort of go, the whole project, the knowledge building project is problematic, and thus we let it, we say be gone with it and we don't even focus on it anymore. But I think if we want to make technologies that are better for kids, we want to make curriculum that's better for kids, we have to look and see at, what explains the potential phenomenon that could be a result of what we're designing or what we're building.
Yeah, totally. And so one place I wanted to go with that line of thinking is, how, as a researcher and writer, do you think about autism? I mean, clearly you're working and we'll get to your methods in the interviews here in a bit, but you're interviewing children who've been diagnosed with autism. So in a way, that work is already done for you. I mean, they've been called this thing, but then how do you think about what it is, right? I mean, what is it socially? What are their symptoms, et cetera, like that? How do you think about it?
Yeah. So for me, I had this really sort of interesting lens because I was looking at it relative to their uses of media and technology.
Right.
And so that for me was that was the sort of center. And so then when I do that, I'm looking at in what ways does this technology, and again, just looking at their autistic characteristics or how their autism manifests. How might the technology be something that is pleasurable or adaptable for them? In some ways, might it be disruptive or, overstimulating? So on one level, sort of how that manifests relative to the behaviors that I observed, things that their parents sort of told me happen. But then for me, it's always, I think about autism relative to all these other aspects of a child's background.
Right.
So that's why I mentioned somewhere in the book where for me, it was kind of shocking when I read some of these reviews in the psychology literature, folks that were really sort of critical of the fact that here's all these studies of autism that don't report race or gender.
Right.
or
class, which is,
class, right.
is a
all
huge
it does
category
is sort
for
of
you.
how it differentiates kids on the spectrum is through these scores of their autism symptoms. But for me to understand what these kids were doing with technology, with media, I really fully had to understand, and not just as a sort of a box to check, but how all of those factors shaped their parents' availability to support them in their technologies, how any of that affected the physical space that they had around them, what the safety of their neighborhoods, what it means. We talk about, current thinking of, the latest media panic book, Jonathan Haidt's, Anxious Generation, with sort of this ending of we really have to kids go out and play-based childhoods.
Yeah.
And here I am thinking, here are children for whom the possibilities of play could be really fantastic. But making that happen is not something that you can let fully be child-directed when a child maybe has a tendency to bolt, or their ability to executive functioning is very challenging for them. So, needing reminders or needing really sort of strong scaffolding, needing a schedule, all of those things are necessities. So for me, it's about not just thinking about, I guess, these edge cases or outlier cases, which for me in the field of children and media, one thing that got me into all this research was, I think, reading a couple pieces where, it's and for this study, we excluded any kid who had a diagnosis of this. Now we're just focusing on the regular kind of quote unquote children. And I read enough of those papers to go, but there's also no research on this population you've just excluded. So how would you, do you know actually that they're so different? So it's the other kind of thing to take from the book. Do we know that they're so different from all of these other kids? Not necessarily, but the ways that they are different, what I kind of keep saying in the book is then you do have to look beyond just the factor of autism. You have to look at all these other ways that shape how any child is engaging with media, how any parent is working with whatever set of resources or constraints that they have, and making choices based on that.
Right. Well, and access to services too, right? I mean, that's the other thing that you point out so well in the book. I mean, and I see it in my own life. I mean, Blacksburg is a pretty, where I live, Blacksburg, Virginia, is a pretty well-to-do area. It's very privileged in a lot of ways. But I see kids and families who have very mild speech issues who are getting like full speech coaching and all this speech therapy and all this kind of stuff. And, it's just not available to so many other kids. So these class things, they have huge ramifications for these kinds of issues.
And even if you do have access, like the wait lists, there might,
totally.
Even in Boston, like there's a lot, but then it's the lag. And then, thinking about, okay, well, I've lost that 6 months, I've lost that year. And there's an anxiety among, for some parents, what could my child have done during that time period when we were just waiting?
Yeah. So how'd you get onto this book? You wrote 2 earlier books, Digital Youth with Disabilities and Giving Voice, Mobile Communication, Disability and Inequality. And the second book, I think, is pretty a focus on autism too. That's one of your major foci. So what led you to this project out of those other ones?
Yeah. So Digital Youth with Disabilities was a kind of a book length report that I, through kind of my academic affiliations with USC and the advisors I was working with, put a lot of grant funded work with the MacArthur Foundation, that I was kind of commissioned to write this book length report on what do we know? What does the literature say on disabilities, young people with disabilities and their technology use? And it ended up being a book that I not only to kind of review the literature, but really wanted to frame how did we get to this point where we even talk about things like screen time. And looking at that through a critical disability lens is something that I also kind of put it. So I feel like I also kind of in that book sort of, horseshoed in a bunch of historical work on when did time become a thing that people became so into? What medical or kind of clinical fields brought that in when that wasn't necessarily what people were talking about, that quantifiable way of measuring children's engagement with media and technology, particularly with TV at that point. And so Giving Voice came out of my dissertation work. And that was where I was really focused on, I started my dissertation, my PhD in 2010 when the iPad came out, and all of this focus just in the world of young people, media and technology, just thinking about how touchscreen mobile devices, now kids don't need to use a joystick or a mouse or a keyboard to use the computer. They can just use their fingers. And so that opened up all sorts of conversations about, young children and technology, but then also about young people with disabilities and technology. And so I saw that as, again, just sort of and for me as somebody who my professional work before I went to get a PhD in the professional world of children in media, I worked in Sesame Street. I worked, for Nickelodeon as a researcher. And a lot of that was focused on inclusive representation in children's media.
Okay.
I worked on a show that was like the first Asian American lead character for a children's TV show, or at least the only one at the time that was on the air. So that was part of my professional background. And here I kind of realized, well, this is a population it's quite sizable for how it's completely absent from the literature. But for Giving Voice, I was really interested in the use of these now increasingly ubiquitous mobile technologies when I became interested in that population, and I came to learn about this way of using a mobile device as a way of talking, like how Stephen Hawking had used his souped up computer to be able to do that. But here's this other thing that this technology could do. And then when I thought about it, I was, and me as somebody who had also been really interested in young people and phones and technology and the literature on mobile communication. And here I went, okay, this is mobile. This is the epitome of like mobile communication, but it's not at all in any of this literature. Why is that? And so for me, it was about, the book, the way I got into it was sort of trying to take what I saw as two disparate areas of work and literature and just trying to bridge them where I saw really natural overlaps. And so it was an ethnography of young people with developmental disabilities who were being trained on how to use these technologies in the greater Los Angeles area with their parents, and kind of a sociological study of the ways in which, there are these claims about, and these were claims that were existing long before the iPad about how these technologies, quote unquote, give voice. And for me, it was an investigation of the limits of that discourse. When I looked at the actual outcomes and when I looked at the challenges that families were coming up against. But so of those kids, a large portion of them, were on the autism spectrum, but there were also kids with, there's other developmental disabilities that can manifest in an inability to produce oral speech. So Down syndrome,
Sure.
something called Engelman's. But again, a lot of them were on the autism spectrum. And I had left out of the book basically anything that had to do with anything else they were doing with the iPad. I was just looking at this one function. I was looking at it how that one function complicated the medical uses of an iPad can be used for anything. And when kids desired or parents wanted it to be used for something else, the way that conflicted with some of the clinical aims and goals. But I didn't analyze that actual engagement that I observed or parents talked about. So then I realized, okay, well, there's a whole book here to start off with some of that data, but then to expand it out here in Boston, where I'm just focused on this population, and I'm focused on, again, what are all these other things that they're doing with media and technology, with a particular emphasis, and this is where I kind of theoretically in the book tried to make this broader contribution to, as a clinical population, the ways that autism is framed and defined is around social kind of quote unquote deficits, a lack of sociality, a lack of social skills, a lack of social communication. And I wanted to, as I had with my prior project, thinking about what is voice, all these claims, what's a really grounded perspective? I'm thinking about how is it constructed in this context? And for this book, I wanted to think about how is the social constructed in this context, to not start from the absence of it, but to try to understand what its presence might be and how it might just look different. And for that, I ended up drawing on cultural anthropology, other kind of fields that have done so much work on that, but hadn't maybe necessarily thought about it relative to technology and society and our theories of change in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. And you kind of already mentioned this, but I was going to ask you about it anyway. I mean, so that you mentioned in the book and other places that you've done this kind of consulting. Now, you've worked with Sesame Street, Nickelodeon, and PBS Kids on a variety of stuff around inclusivity and accessibility. And so, did that include thinking about autism and other forms of disability when you were doing this work?
So yeah, that work is ongoing. Like I sort of did that work in the I've done that work sort of around sort of inclusivity and developing curriculum. It's sort of like a side. It is part of my research, but also quite separate in some ways. Developing curriculum for children's preschool TV shows,
cool.
But also consulting on or advising, kind of development folks about directions of how shows might go and how they might be a little bit different and how they might want to consider who they bring on as writers. It's gentle nudging because I mean, folks, for example, like PBS Kids, these are the best possible people that you would want to be, who are having the most careful, considered ways of approaching this work. Relative to everything that's on Netflix, everything that's on YouTube. These are the people who have the resources and who have the energy and the care to ask the kinds of questions. And so for me, just as somebody who likes to think of themselves as pretty well read, or at least pretty well aware of what there is to read, and conversations to be had, I tend to just be sort of a nudger of, oh, you should check out this person. I had a really great conversation with them, and I think they could, this autistic person who has expressed an interest in writing in this space, they might be a person to look to. So that's where, for me, that work has, I've hopefully made some kind of impact or some kind of difference in that respect.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so one of the things I loved about your new book is I've been working on an essay for a while. I'm hoping to finish it up in the next couple of weeks. It's called Method and Technology Studies. Become very focused on empirics in general and the kind of work. And you know this lovely sentence you said, I said about working on this book to reconcile how neurotypical people could talk with such authority about the relationship between autism, children, and technology without a strong empirical basis to their claims. And it was such a wonderful, there were a couple lines like this throughout the introduction, where it's like, it's amazing how much people have to say about this topic without having like actual evidence other than anecdote, right? I mean, it's really, it's amazing.
And it's amazing, like, I mean, because some stories are really powerful. They make great movies. They make great New York Times bestsellers. Yeah. They're one-offs, and the one-offs come to mean something much more than it's about the human spirit. But that's not what we base policy off of. That's not what we should be basing technology design off of.
Yeah.
And so it's I guess, the kind of frustration with that, where people who have personal stories that are rich and interesting, and that's, these are, there are books that, movies that came out in recent years, the Life Animated, it was a big Oscar, about a New York Times writer who, a kind of very celebrated writer whose son learned to communicate basically through his working through and around Disney films and movies. Or Just Story with Love, another New York Times, bestseller. And I don't want to discredit, the truths of those families that exist. But again, that's one family. That's a very rich experience. But again, we should not extrapolate, especially considering I tried to really go out of my way in this research to sample, across and to have kind of half of my sample be non-white, to have a large portion be, lower income earners, a large portion of immigrant families that took part in my study. They don't, and again, it's not that their experiences are going to be wholly undifferent from what those examples are, but the things that are different really do require some up close, examination.
Yep, totally. And there was so you interviewed more than 60 children between the ages of 3 and 13 in Boston and Los Angeles. And tell people a bit about the research you did, your process.
Yeah. So not all of those kids could be interviewed. So there was limits to, just like in my last book, if a child doesn't have an effective form of communication, either through oral speech or a bunch of them had devices that they maybe not were using so effectively in school, but definitely weren't at home. So they didn't have an effective way to engage in what would be a traditional interview with me. There was one child who did type to communicate, and their parent, I basically sent them an interview, and then they helped their child kind of complete it and send it back to me. So it was mediated in that respect. So even just the idea of you're just interviewing the child or you're just interviewing the parent, the way that those interconnections and the ways that what independence kind of quote unquote looked like, it's scaffolded. Even like kids that I was interviewing where a parent would be within earshot and they would, ask their parent to be like, what was that show I wasn't, that YouTube, channel I'm not allowed to watch so that I knew, but they didn't know. So it's not that it's a collective interview, but some of those were scaffolded in those kinds of ways. But everything started off with a parent interview because I needed to know, again, not that, and some studies just like leave it there. They just do a parent survey and that's, said and done. But I needed to know the context because there definitely were going to be things that I didn't want to ask kids about if I knew that it was going to be upsetting to them. That if or maybe they made it clear later on that there was something they didn't want to talk about. And I knew what it was based on my prior conversations. So I'm able to add some context to what they're saying. So, but I wanted to start with that, also just to also know like their child's communication preferences. What will is there probably going to be a likelihood that we'll need to take breaks, or I'll need to maybe cut something short, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That for me was, and it also gave me an experience because I did this research before the pandemic. I would usually go to people's houses to do that interview. So I also got to see the child's environment. I got to see what the media space, the sort of sensory space looked like. before then arriving there. And also the parent was familiar with me before I then arrived to talk with and spend time with their child. And so with the child, knowing that many of these children for whom routine is important, wanting to observe a media or technology routine, something that generally happens at a general time, so that I can come observe it. And I wanted to, for at least the younger kids, to see them doing it with another person. Like, what's something that they are generally doing with somebody else? I wanted to not again start off assuming that, oh, this child is going to be totally solo doing this, that they're probably going to be, even if it's their own device, around other people. I want to observe where the social interactions happen, what they look like, or is it like co-play where it's playing a video game together? And then for some of the older kids, I kind of gave them the option of, because they're more likely to be doing some things that are more independent than not. And then just a lot of question asking about and observing of behavior and of, where do kids have strengths? Where do I see creativity? Where do I see frustration? Where do I see, learning happening, in ways that might not be the traditional form of it, but it's clearly happening. It happened, and it seems like it happened exclusively through YouTube. What do we make of this? There's like a whole section in the chapter that's on learning. That's, parents talking about how great YouTube is at the same point, but also talking about another point, parts of the chapter, how terrible it is.
Sure.
But it's both.
Yeah, totally. A couple other questions before we dive into, a couple of the chapters, just give people a taste. As we've discussed, like class and race and these other categories are very central to your analysis. And there was a sentence that really stuck out to me, and it was news to me, striking news. You're right, race, class, and ableism work in tandem. In the United States, more than half, 56% of autistic children live in poverty, whereas of the children not on the spectrum, the rate is 42 to 47%. Wow, this really kind of knocked me over when I read it. And I just wondered, is there a literature on this connection between class and autism? Like, what's going on here?
So it's complicated, in part, even just the causes of autism itself.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is something that, to say it's highly politicized would be an understatement. So yeah, unpacking these relationships requires some discussion about factors, like environmental factors, certainly, who has access to good maternal health care, who is more likely to be exposed to sort of environment stressors that have an impact then on genetics, and that there's a strong genetic component to the development of autism. There's also prenatally an environmental factor as well. So again, nobody really knows the why of that, but the understanding of how that is bundled up with the manifestation of autism in young people is something to sort of think about. But then beyond that sort of causal stuff, it's also really expensive to have a child with disabilities.
Yeah.
And so it might not also just be something related to who's more likely to, in terms of, and be a child who is on the autism spectrum, but thinking about how we live in a society that is not set up to help every family thrive in an equal manner, and how that leads to things like women leaving the workforce so that they can be the one who is driving their child to appointments, that is, there to support them. So I met plenty of families for whom like that was the case, where that then changed, and then also for some of those families, sorry to even add another factor to that.
No, it's good.
They might also be more likely themselves to be neurodivergent. Yeah. And so the ways that it's difficult for those parents to also stay gainfully employed, or even to have like had a college education that led then to employment.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of different other potential kinds of factors that can be bound up with that.
Yep. That was beautiful. The final kind of just thing to get on the table, I really like, you've already touched on this a bit too, but I really liked all the work you did, especially in the introduction, but then in some other chapters, about this category of the social and how we kind of like define some technologies as social. as if like it's clear like what the hell that means. Like those are social technologies and these ones are not, or something. And like your deconstruction was so nice. Like I can't remember the child's name, but one of the people you did research with, he saw Scratch, which my son is a big Scratch guy, and he, it's this kind of teaching coding software out of MIT. He sees it, it's very social for him too. And in fact, like the whole, there's all kinds of social activities around this, even though it's not formally, as you point out, like social media. So I just wanted you to talk a bit about this, because I really thought it was beautiful about like, well, how do we define these things to begin with, right?
Right. And for me, I was so struck by that. I think where that line for me, that whole like theoretical ground got opened up was for me reading a study that a psychologist had done of studying kids on the autism spectrum. And her and her research team had delineated certain technologies as social media and certain as non-social media.
Okay.
And the sort of part of my brain that, has all this literature background on like TV as a social medium. And,
well, it goes back to like Lazarsfeld on radio stuff, right? I mean, like how people interpreted radio in the 40s or 30s or whatever was highly social and mediated.
Yeah. And so my like just went like just an explosion of
exactly.
Like, okay, so I need to go back and really fully think about where just that framing it's a very convenient tag to place on as a selling point of this genre of mediated communication. And then the evacuation of the social from these non-quantifiable ways, basically. It's not quantifiably social, ergo it's not social. Seem to be that framing. So, that does take then qualitative research to understand those meanings, the meaning making around the social that is happening around these technologies, particularly then thinking about the ways that then the quantifiable social in these networked mediums might or might not be accessible socially to this population. It might be. There's all this research or all this sort of background on autistic people being early internet adopters and listserv users and people who are very, excited to be able to share knowledge and to create community and blog and express themselves in all of these ways that might have been inaccessible in the face-to-face, manner. But at the same time, thinking about how over time, how the dynamics of sociality, of interpreting people's meaning and intent with more ways to communicate, that adds more layers of potentially fraught ways of engaging and of being kind of close to the human, but not quite there in terms of how we relate to one another.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to bring to this, is that's why for me, the thing that I ended up with was this social shaping, how we think about the social shaping of technology as this sort of key framing of like STS and, technology studies literature about we're not going to be so determinate about what technology does to people or what people and kind of designers like do to, are the makers, are the end all be all creators. Like Steve Jobs is, he made the world that we live in now, that kind of framing either. And so we have to think about the nuances there. But at the same time, that social shaping, while it seems to be sort of, it is both about the interpersonal and it is about the infrastructural. Again, it's like, who's social? What are we underpinning? Like that's also full of a kind of value. So that's where I ended up with this socio-technical shaping of sociality to get at that critical reflection on where the neurotypical social, where that normative assumption ends up being embedded in the work.
Yeah. That's great. And it's funny. I just interviewed Dana Boyd recently, and it's just like, it's kind of it's an all over the place conversation, as my conversations with Dana usually are. But I kept thinking about, it's complicated while reading your book, because it seemed like, there's a lot of similarities. Dana was looking at a different population, but the approach seemed very similar, actually, of like doing the ethnographic work. And like, I thought it was just neat, kind of like neurodivergent it's complicated or something like that, was really great, I thought.
That is the highest compliment because
Good.
Dana's work is so richly written and so
Yeah.
well grounded and
Yes.
so. This is going to be me fangirling, but so and because I mean, she does a lot of this work that is, yes, it is on youth, but she's really about this broader sort of theorizing about, like, I
Yes.
love the piece and I love the work she has in that book around addiction and really sort of unpacking where does that turn of phrase come from? Like why it's really complicated. Are you talking about addiction? Like it's a behavior, you're talking about it like it's a substance, like kind of falls short when you're applying that just on a blanket manner to people using the internet because everybody needs to use the internet.
Yeah.
So work like hers or work like Sonia Livingston over in the UK, or just folks who are just total role models in terms of their ability to. Because I think for a long, maybe this is me coming from when I was living in Hollywood, and I was working at the time on like Disney Channel and Nickelodeon, and I had all these friends who were working at like Sony and CIA and all these there were these adult things, and I kind of was like, oh well, I work in kid stuff, and people I felt like that there was a sort of like a demeaning, like, oh, that's like the not important stuff, really. And so I feel like I'm sort of used to intellectually like, well, that's just the kids stuff. It has to do with them. And I think what Dana and like Sonia do is really sort of say, no, actually, it's about kids, but to understand audiences, you need to actually understand this. To understand surveillance or to understand these like big concepts that we're thinking about, actually, you do need to look at children and their experiences. So I look to them as sort of role models in that framing. Like, obviously, we care about the kids too, but we also care about the broader conversations.
Yeah, theorizing human life with technology, and they're part of the mix, aren't they? We can't leave them out. This is definitely one of those books where, I mean, not only just for time, but I do want people to check it out and to feel like there's a lot of stuff they should be diving into, the audience members, when they do so. But I do kind of want to just touch on a couple chapters to give people a taste of things. And I really loved your kind of first body chapter on identity, because I think that this is like just a fascinating topic, and thinking about the role of technology and identity formation for neurodivergent folks and neurotypical folks. I mean, everybody, right? So to unpack a little bit what you wanted to get at in that chapter and what you were kind of finding as you were thinking through identity and technology.
Yeah, so I had to really realize go back a bunch of different steps before I analyze this data to think about what even is identity.
Hmm.
What about individual and collective identity? How do people reconcile identities that are marginalized and yet maintain a sense of selfhood? And one of I think the starting points of where I was really trying to understand the complexity of what identity means relative to autism is the fact that there's a large kind of, I don't have exact percentages, but like number of young people who grow up having had a diagnosis, but their parents not revealing it to them.
Uh-huh.
So that it might
Uh-huh.
not be ever, or maybe not until past college and this is for a certain subpopulation of young people on the spectrum who say go to
Sure.
college or whatever, but that it's not even revealed to them that this is a part of them. So it is a gate kept identity from them, and then
Fascinating.
having
Yeah.
to make sense of of something that maybe could have explained the past to them, but or their the present as they were living it, and maybe they have to reconcile it later on, which is something I do talk about in some of my more recent research. But so for me, when I think about identity, this idea that you can grow up with a sense of selfhood of I belong to this group, and whatever kind of values you might have, or kind of beliefs that are positive or negative valences around what it means to be a part of that group, and how you then, because we think about adolescence as a time where you're trying to navigate, okay, do I want to be identified with what I've been raised with, or kind of separating myself out so I can be a separate person from those who raised me, which is this normal part of adolescence. But I thought about, how like, okay, well, these norms about that you might have an early sense of, you might have talked about, or just able to realize for yourself that you have
Yeah.
this identity, and not in this case, to me, really kind of then got me thinking about in what ways we talk about what language kids have to talk about themselves, and then what media can do for them. Again, for kids who their parents might not have talked about being autistic with them, but they certainly had a sense of being different and of feeling different, and how media can help them, even if it's not media about autism, maybe it's just media about disability. And at the same time, if they do know and they're able to then take advantage of some of these, ways of communicating digitally, expressing themselves, how they can be working through maybe experiences they've had that are discriminatory, or a feeling of being proud in whatever their skills are, knowing that there's all these things that are limitations to them, but that they also think that they have skills, and maybe they see it in a popular character in a graphic novel series, and maybe they then create something digitally that represents that. So it was for me kind of coming to kind of understand the complexity of what we talk about identity, and yes, the political nature of who is claiming an identity, who is defining what an identity means, or from the inside or from the outside. And so this presented a very interesting case to delve. And then again, with technology, how does technology identify you? How do you use technology to work through identity? And that's something that I, very much came to work through with this population.
That's wonderful. As you're talking through it, I kind of, I saw it more and more as a kind of pragmatist perspective that, we're going through life, and concepts are tools, and we also have these technologies that allow us to access media. And, sometimes with some of these children you're talking about, like, some tools have been withheld from them by parents, loving parents who think it might harm them some way to have these frameworks. And so they find other kinds of frameworks elsewhere in a kind of piecemeal fashion. And just hearing you talk about it through it in that way just kind of brought out a different dimension of it that I think is in the book. But just, when we talk through things in different ways, different sides pop out. So I really like that.
Yeah. And this is where I also think about some of my background in child development. There's a great just sort of child psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, who, Vygotsky, and sort of, that we think about what tools are, concepts are tools, words are tools, and kind of Vygotsky adds this sort of sociocultural aspect of child development that isn't just ages and stages. I talk about this in my class on children and technology. We have to understand the background of where did all these ideas about children and how they grow and develop come from. They're not, some of them are relevant. Some of them, we have to think about where they have limits to them.
Sure.
Anyway, so that's what that was always sort of in the background of way I approach these questions. Cool.
Yeah, I'm really into kind of Gestalt psychology and Vygotsky and pragmatism and stuff. And in fact, my friend at Johns Hopkins, Julia Frumer, is about to hold a kind of a gathering about psychology and history, that you would be a perfect person for thinking about how to bring actual psychological thinking into how we analyze things. So anyway, I'm very interested in these kind of cultural cognition questions and such, which I think can see in the kind of background here. So your book has 3 sections or 3 parts: belonging, relationships, where you talk about family and friendship. And then there's a section on embodiment where you talk about senses and kind of embodiment. And then a section on emotions. And I thought that it might be, just to give listeners another taste, I was thinking about we could talk about the emotions chapter, because I think that is very wrapped up with identity, actually. And also there are all these bizarre notions about autistic emoting and emotions. So why don't you give us a taste of what you were up to in that chapter, and what you were trying to do there.
Yeah. So again, thinking about these myths and stereotypes that exist around, that's the way I kind of approach all these. What are these myths, and where does technology play in, and how do we complicate them? And so the idea of autistic people being emotionless, devoid of emotion, but how very often that's just non-observable, or non-observable in a neurotypical manner of emotion. So I had to frame that before I even got into the technology, looking at some of these studies that are now coming out that challenge some of these psychological assumptions about when autistic people are kind of self-reporting like what a successful interaction feels like, or what their expressions of, when they're feeling grief, and it might not be, expressed on their face. That doesn't mean they're not feeling it. And so that the observable, the quantifiable, way of just even kind of framing like what even are emotions, which is something that, obviously all these wonderful scholars of technology and emotion, and even just also like just scholars of emotion that are like, there's a woman, Lisa Barrett Feldman, that's here at Northeastern, who's done this really fantastic work about the ways that how emotions that are not innate, like the ways that they are socially relative.
I didn't know she was. Where's she at? Is she at your school?
She's at Northeastern, yeah.
Oh, cool. Sure, her work is fascinating on exactly on this front. So yeah.
Yeah, and the ways that then other folks who have done this work on like emotion AI and the sort of fraught nature of the way that emotion is then like sort of deployed in a way that is both kind of extractive and also the way that it distorts perhaps the like whatever kind of outcomes are intended by the technology might not be the best outcomes for the individual who might be then the recipient of, or the user, or the data, the person whose data is being employed in the use of this emotion AI. And so for me, some of that stuff then where it relates to even the history of emotion AI and where autism is embedded in it. Jeff Nagy, his work for me was like a very interesting historical, again, like twist on, oh, wow, it turns out that like autistic young people have been test subjects for this work. So for me, trying to really sort of bring their perspective, their experiences with technology and media and emotion in this way. Also, the question around emotionless, and it also really is so problematic thinking about the kinds of trauma that autistic young people potentially go through in their lives, whether it's related to experiences at school, in their community, relative to the therapies that they are potentially negatively subjected to, that those experiences of trauma, again, emotion and embodied emotion at that. So the emotionless framing, again, it primarily serves to like quantify and to manage kind of unruly autistic individuals, children or adults. And so in the chapter, I really kind of thought about how is media used to express emotion?
Yes.
How does it complicate, potentially positive, but also potentially negatively, the management of emotions? How might media be so emotionally overwhelming that it does lead to kind of a shutting down and stuff that, again, a neurotypical person might be not so super affected by, but it might very much affect an autistic child. And so working through the way that you just understand what emotions are, because understanding those nuances, that media can be a helpful tool for helping to drive inquiry around that. So, and this is again all to sort of lead to how do we create better schools? How do we better support parents? How do we create more confident kids who have better livelihoods, better lives?
You're taking me exactly where I wanted to go to next. I don't share notes or questions, but you're right on cue. So go for it. I mean, so give us a sense of some of the recommendations you make. You're pretty thorough, but just, hit some high points that you care about.
Yeah. So I talk in the book about just ways that I think some of the safeguards that are put online for safety, for privacy, the ways in which those can be really difficult for autistic kids or adults to interpret and to make sense of. I think there's a general sense of cognitive inaccessibility, obviously terms of service. Mm-hmm. These are not designed for people to understand well, because you want people to stay on the app. You want to collect as much data as possible. That's the bread and butter. That's what these apps are designed for. But I think that there is space to give not that parents should have to be the ones that are constantly monitoring and on top of everything when there's, industry and policymakers who need to be also, in the background here. But I think for designers, at least, that I talk about a couple different examples where there could be more nuanced ways that parents can control some of what their kids are exposed to, because it really is that gray area, or the in-between space of, you want to give your kids some freedom, but you also really need to, this one type of video is going to lead to this, or to have really more customized or catered, personalized ways of curating that. There's always room for more of that and more explanation around that. And that's what these parents seem to really be asking for, and to really have no awareness of, or difficulty figuring out how to do it. So I think that translation work isn't just on parents. That also can fall onto the shoulders of educators or librarians, or even like the therapists who work with families and kids, that this is something that could be genuinely, useful for them as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and then it leads to, like, how you'd want just finer grained filters for YouTube Kids or whatever it is, right? That, like, if some topic is triggering, then you could, sort by metadata or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear that we can customize things in endless ways. It's not as if it's not possible to do it. So yeah. And then I talk about, for clinicians, also thinking about the ways that, I talk about in the learning chapter, that autistic kids' interests, and this is something that other folks have written about kind of more generally. Again, thinking about how autism is defined and framed, that areas of interest are kind of quote unquote like restrictive or repetitive, and sometimes those might be interests that other kids have if a kid that's their flavor of autism. It's the kind where you have like extensive knowledge of like 18th century map making, and that's your thing.
Birds,
but it could
whatever,
be your thing for like when you're 4, and then when you're 5, you move on to like, the world's great paleontologists or something like that. But then if your interest is superheroes, and you have an encyclopedic knowledge of superheroes, which turns out there's a lot of people who like go to Comic-Con who do, who might also be neurodivergent, and then you find a community of people who share your special intense interest. And so for me, it's thinking about, in the field of education, there's all this discussion about interest-driven learning. You take advantage of kids' interest. But then there's all this other literature that historically has pathologized what autistic kids are interested in.
Yeah. It's like too nerdy on that. Yeah.
Right. And I saw examples of this, kids being, not, their education really not being customized to like kids who absolutely could learn, but who it wasn't syncing up with at all.
Right.
So I think a more expansive view, but again, that doesn't just go to an individual teacher. That's related more broadly to like administration and how schools are set up, et cetera.
Yeah.
But it's trying to, again, sort of flip, again, all this literature that's coming from one space that I see and how it really wasn't applied in this other realm, and to get them in greater conversation.
Excellent. And so where are you headed next? I hear, so you said you got some piles of money. Is that right? You got some grants that you're doing work under. And before we pressed record, you were saying that you might be headed into a kind of more article-driven moment in your career. So yeah, tell us what you're up to and where you're headed right now.
Yeah, I think there's definitely always a potential for more books, but sometimes you're in a space where like, is this an article or is this a book?
Yeah.
And you have to see what other troves of things you discover. And that's going to be more of the historical side of things. Maybe I'll get into that first, where like historical wise, I feel like I haven't really found a really good cultural history of synthetic speech that exists out there.
Okay.
So of having computers talk, and the actual talking, the actual voices, not voice recognition necessarily. I mean, Mara Mills has done like foundational work on all of this, but I think there's all this work that's from like the 1970s, like 60s, 70s, in that space of like, why do the voices sound the way that they sound? And when did, and for me, the really important part of this is the role of disabled people, especially non-speaking individuals, in the development of synthetic speech technologies. So there's a whole history that I have I have one thing that would be an article that I'd have to go to the archive for, but I'm not sure if I want to get into the whole cultural history of synthetic speech as like the next book project. But I know that there's a history there of the role of disabled people in the development of that history. I also have this, I keep putting it out there as, I don't know if I'm the person to write this, but I think there is an absolute cultural or a history to be written about Stevie Wonder as a technologist.
Oh, yes.
In the realm of, obviously music technologies, but in the realm of assistive technology as well. He's been actually a very landmark individual. And what I found also cursorily digging through some archives is the way that he also has influenced other assistive technologists and collaborators as well. A whole history there.
Fascinating character.
Those are on the shelf of things to do.
Just one thing on Stevie. I mean, I bet we could go back and find some books written about him and his disability that are just terrible and full of stereotypes and shit. I have no doubt about that. But it is fascinating to me how he is, in my experience, usually cast as a character with agency, right? As usually seen as a very capable guy who kind of, and which is just like so often with disabled people, that's not the case, So I don't know. Anyway, I'm just backing your story, backing your thing.
I would argue that like Stevie Wonder's brilliance isn't just in his like actual brilliance, but his brilliance to capacity build as well, and to build for others, to also build for themselves and for their communities too.
Yeah, very cool.
Part of that, but then so I do have so it's coming out of the research. That, for the book, I only looked at kids that were ages 3 to 13. And I looked at social media, but, if they were under 13, they kind of technically shouldn't have been on it, but they were. But I realized that I needed to age up a little bit and start to think about teenage, young adult years and what was going on there. And so I have some grants that I'm writing to kind of explore that more. But I got one for Northeastern internally to work with somebody in our applied psychology department. I was thinking about gender and autism, and I'd come across some data that was on how there's a large portion of individuals who have been diagnosed or who would be kind of qualified to be diagnosed as anorexic, who a high percentage of whom also would qualify or do have a diagnosis of autism, and the ways in which that is also then largely women. And yet, then I thought about all of the literature that's on body image and disordered eating, and the ways in which that autism doesn't appear in any of that literature, or sort of that in social media, and how that's not a variable, it's not a factor in there. And to me, there's again these literatures. I go, well, that thing would seem to be very related to this, but nobody actually knows what the relationship is, because it might be a different relationship. It very well could, but nobody's done enough digging to see what that connection is, because eating disorders are, especially like anorexia, like of the deadliest of psychiatric disorders. So there's a clear kind of mandate to try to improve lives, save lives. And so we are, and then thinking about social media and where is there autistic community that is developing. And that's something that I and some collaborators we published a piece in New Media and Society last year that was on, or actually it was online last year, but now it's who knows when it'll actually come out, on autistic TikTok. And TikTok as a space. Yes. I always preface this by saying TikTok on one hand is garbage and terrible and like the worst of human impulses exists on that app. Also the best impulses, and like it's all of them at once. And
especially on things like this, I think actually these ADHD TikTok and stuff like that. Amazing tool of sharing and commiserating and all these things. And yet you also see some, I don't know if we want to use the term, misinformation. There's all kinds of things float around in those space. Yeah, exactly.
Isn't necessarily, and again, they say guided by medical knowledge, but there's a lot of ways in which medical knowledge falls short. And
that too.
People are saying, hey, actually, here's the thing that you have missed for a really long time. And we've all been telling you that it's relevant. And here we are en masse telling you that it's relevant. So, and this is also work that with the prior work, I was kind of the lone ethnographer. And, I'm working with bringing in autistic kids in their experiences first and fronter, but in this kind of next stage of my work, trying to be much more intentional about collaborating with the I haven't said this. So I'm not neurodivergent. I don't identify as neurodivergent. And so there is absolutely a being open to learning, and this is why I take such a grounded perspective. And I read so widely, I think, on all of this, but really trying a mandate to collaborate more with and be partners in research with neurodivergent individuals. So trying to collaborate, co-author, have as research assistants, in all of the phases of the work, for the work to be good, I think. And so doing that, we looked at autistic TikTok and what kind of discussions around diagnosis were happening outside of just the headlines about everybody's self-diagnosing themselves now after watching all these things. And basically the punchline of that piece is it's way more complicated than that. Like, yes, there are people talking about how they have these suspicions, these senses of what is the algorithm, the algorithmized self. What is that? How is that being shaped? But there's also just people coming to terms with, they have been diagnosed. It wasn't TikTok that did it. But they don't know what to do with that now, and turning to these spaces, or they question whether they do or not. And they're working through that actively through, so we looked at the videos. We also looked at just tens of thousands of comments as well to make sense of that. But anyway, with the grant I have, it's looking at a portion of that that's on what on TikTok, what kind of conversations around food and eating and potentially disordered eating are happening on autistic TikTok. And then we're going to also be following up then, thanks to this grant, with doing sort of some designed experiments with taking some of those stimuli and seeing how autistic and non-autistic people kind of think about those similarly or differently. And then also doing interviews with autistic women and non-binary individuals who have had experiences with disordered eating or with sort of body image, and thinking about social media just as one factor, one variable in those experiences for them is something that we're going to delve into as well. Just to lead to more kind of culturally appropriate, sensitive treatment spaces. Also just thinking about how, just in general, young people in mental health, how it's not one size fits all, and trying to be more sensitive to that space as well.
Well, Meryl, I love it all. That's all very exciting, and we should definitely have you on in the future to talk more about this work. Well, I mean, one thing I really like about your work, and you're not the only person I have on who I say this about, but I mean, it's true that you called it grounded perspective, but you're really an empiricist in so many ways of just seeing these spaces where it's a lot of people talking, not a lot of people digging, and then you go and do the work. So I really appreciate that. And you and I were mentioning before, we've been in contact for years and years, and yet this was the first time we ever had a conversation. So it was just as fun as I thought it would be. So thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Yes, it's nice to have a forum where I'd say I'm a social scientist with humanistic leanings.
Yes, me too.
I really want to be able to, I'm observing something that people are calling new, and I want to understand and unpack that to figure out what came before, what isn't new about this, just as somebody who's a history nerd at heart and wants to be able to frame all of that. So I appreciate a forum to be all of those things and to talk about all of those things here with you.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. People's and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other People's and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.